This interview is sponsored by the James J. Blanchard Living Library for the Michigan Political History Society. I'm John Lindstrom, and we're interviewing today Doug Roberts, a man who is best known as playing a leading role in Michigan's finance and economic development over the last almost half century, and who, if things had gone a little bit differently, might have been remembered as a world champion duckpin bowler. You were on the circuit for a very brief time as a young man, weren't you?
John, thank you, and I'm glad the opportunity. And yes, when I was in college, I was technically a professional bowler. Now, at that time, the rules for the NCAA were that if you accepted any money in any sport, you were finished. So I could not compete in college. Duckpin bowling was in the East Coast where I grew up. It is the same size alley, but it's a very small ball. It's 3 pounds, 10 ounces. And I went to a number of tournaments all summer long. And at the end of the summer, I decided going back to college was a wiser choice.
And you started in college at the University of Maryland.
University of Maryland, that's correct.
Yes, and you were studying chemistry originally.
That is correct.
And so what led you to study economics instead?
The truth of the matter is that I went to the University of Maryland and I was majoring in chemistry. And my second semester in my freshman year, I flunked out of chemistry. I didn't have bad grades outside of chemistry. So I ran over to the business school and took a number of business classes, and economics just came very easy.
And after you graduated from Maryland, you decided to go on with your education. What brought you to Michigan State?
I applied to 5 universities, and I applied to the doctoral program in economics. One university offered me money. That was Michigan State. So one could technically probably say for $300 a month for 9 months, I got bought. But I got in-state tuition. I was newly married. I lived in Spartan Village, and so I was very pleased with the opportunity to come here.
And instead of getting into things like finance and some of the more theoretical aspects of economics, you seem to be interested right off the bat with public finance.
I did. My major right away was public finance. It was called state and local finance. And I ultimately not only got my doctorate in that, but I wrote my thesis on state taxes in Michigan. And so, I mean, I really had a background in taxes from the very beginning.
Probably a good thing you were already married. I can't imagine writing about state taxes would have been a big pickup line in a bar.
I tend to think that's probably true. But yes, I was very fortunate. I was married to a delightful lady.
And having gotten your doctorate in looking at state finances, is that why you chose then to look at working in public service?
I went into public service primarily because that was the history of my family. So if you don't mind, I'd like to go back just a little bit. I grew up outside of Washington, D.C., in a Maryland suburb. My father was a member of the United States Secret Service. He protected 5 presidents. He was with President Kennedy when he was assassinated. It was a big deal, and that's a story for another day. But public service was a big deal in my family. So when I was getting my doctorate at MSU, ironically, the two sort of went together, because I did not finish my doctorate and go to work. I finished all my exams, and I'm writing my doctorate, my thesis, and I got to work for a gentleman by the name of George Montgomery. So I was working for Representative George Montgomery, who was chair of the House Taxation Committee, and that's when I finished my thesis.
And George Montgomery, obviously many people will not remember that name or know that name, but he was a legend in his own time, not just in his own mind, but in his own time. And he was a really amazing kind of a character, would you say?
George Montgomery was wonderful, and he treated me so extraordinary. I'm not sure that I fully appreciate it when you're very young and you have somebody who literally says, I'm going to be your mentor without you asking. And he was. He knew an awful lot about taxes. He was not educated in taxes. He was out of the 5th District of Detroit. He was chair of the Taxation Committee, and he taught me a great deal. In terms of how taxes work, who the players were in taxes, and so I can't say how much I enjoyed it. There are 2 stories that I'd like to tell about George Montgomery. In addition to all the things that we worked on, that when I worked for him for 5 years, But the first story deals with a completely different world from the world we live in right now, completely different. At that time, chair of committees were very, very important. You could hardly get an amendment on a bill on the floor without going through the chair. If the chair opposed, the majority party would vote it down. So I remember sitting next to him, again, a very young person, and a representative comes up to Mr. Montgomery, is what I called him, and said to the chairman, he said, would you put this amendment on the bill that's coming up? George read the bill. He looked at the legislator and said, if I put the amendment on, will you vote for the bill? And the guy said, no. George looked at the amendment and says, yeah, I'll put it on. Of course, I'm sitting here thinking, this wasn't any book I learned. So after the guy left, I looked at Mr. Montgomery and I said, what was that all about? He said, when a gentleman asks you to do something and then has the ability to say no, his word is good. I can deal with this person. I'll get his vote on something else later. That's a completely different world from what we live in right now. So, I mean, I learned a lot in terms of long-term thinking past it. I also learned about the issue, how you win is as important sometimes as how you lose. Because tomorrow in government is another day. And you have to sometimes think about tomorrow. And regrettably, I don't think that happens very much today. Let me just continue with Representative Montgomery for just a little longer. While I had the privilege of working for him, we worked on things that people forget all about. One of them was called the single business tax. 1975, we adopted the single business tax. I was a big supporter of it. I was one of the very few legislative staff who understood it and was asked to explain it all over the place, and which I did. It was adopted. And in 2006, it was repealed. So that's my legacy on that one. But we also adopted other bills. The homestead property tax credit. And people have been using it for, 40 years. We adopted that at the same time, 1974. There's another bill called the Plant Rehabilitation District, PA 198 in 1974. We adopted that. I had the opportunity to be on the ground floor of a number of really remarkable achievements in government, and I was very proud of that.
And I don't want to gloss over those because each one of those was incredibly dramatic to the state finance system as well as to economic development. You talk about, for example, the single business tax. That was a really, really difficult vote to go through, was it not?
No, it's very difficult.
And because, explain a little bit what was involved here. You were taking, 6 separate taxes that affected businesses?
That's correct.
And turning it all into one, which on the surface sounds like maybe that's a good idea, but it was incredibly controversial.
It was. And the reason is because the whole country of the United States, even to this day, is very used to the issue of the income tax, either for individuals or for corporations, a corporation income tax. And that's what Michigan had. Michigan had a corporation income tax. It had a financial institution income tax. It had what was called an inventory tax, which was a property tax that applied only on one day on your inventory. We had all sorts of taxes that applied. And so what this proposal was to basically go off the income tax approach and go to a much, we argued, a much more stable approach, which is a very large base and a very small rate. Let me just continue something. The history of Michigan is a roller coaster in terms of the economy. We have been going up and down. The changes in the individual income tax from year to year was like 20 and 30%. You can't write a budget when you have that sort of changes year to year. So the idea was, let's have a little bit more stability, a little less fluctuation, and then that will ultimately be a better system. It was incredibly controversial, and frankly, I really, to this day, I will just say it, it had a one-time benefit because of the way it was structured to the budget of something like $100 million. Today, $100 million is, who's all that excited? That was a big number then. And that meant you didn't have to either raise other taxes or you didn't have to cut the budget. So I think that played a bigger role than some of us will. It wasn't all, this is absolutely a better tax. I believe that, but I believe a lot of votes were accomplished because it gave us a one-time benefit. But this was a base which people would look at and say, are you kidding me? It was you took all your wages and salaries, you took your depreciation, you took the interest paid and your profits, and you added them up and applied a very small number rate. The argument is it was a tax basically on size. A bigger company paid more taxes, A smaller company paid less taxes. It wasn't, even though profits was included, it wasn't a profits tax. It was a much more stable tax for Michigan, and I think for a long time served Michigan well in that
You also
capacity.
had a number of businesses who, to some degree, have been exempt from an awful lot of those other taxes. I remember the hotel industry, for example.
The ones who really hit us hard were service industries. And one of the reasons that I think the single business tax got off to a bad foot is the businesses that got hit and their taxes did go up were something called accountants. They're the ones that did the taxes. So when somebody would come in and saying, you don't know how bad this tax is, they made sure to point out anything that was a negative in the tax that the business may not have liked. So, but also, doctors, even my own dentist decided he didn't like the tax because it raised his individual tax. So
Did he do any extra drilling on you?
I don't know, but I didn't argue with him until it was over. I will say that.